We are back with Epen Thampy, and we are talking about a 2026 statewide ballot initiative, which would take the cannabis plant, right, Epen, and
That's right.
we would stop dividing it into marijuana and hemp in terms of what is legal, what is not legal in Missouri, who has access to the market, who doesn't have access to the market. If you're joining us on Apple Podcasts or on YouTube, go back to the September 13th edition of this show and listen to B Block. We're in C Block right now. B Block has the first part of our conversation with Epen. Epen, at the end of B Block, you were talking about how President Trump might choose to reschedule marijuana. And how would that affect things like banking and investment that would eventually trickle down to Missouri hemp growers?
Yeah. Well, President Trump, when he removes the federal prohibition on marijuana and brings it down to Schedule 3, is going to do something that a lot of people feel it seems like they're very confused by, but is actually very simple. So when marijuana is Schedule 3, it's going to be legal by prescription. So think about all the ways that this could be utilized in a pharmaceutical or a hospital or a traditional healthcare setting. I mean, no physician is going to prescribe that you smoke marijuana, but you have a lot of medical delivery devices, transdermal patches, nebulizers, etc., that you could adapt THC or some kind of cannabis constituent into utility. And so that's going to open up state and interstate and international commerce opportunities. On the hemp side, it will affect that policy area primarily because the FDA will finally begin doing what it should have been doing 5 years ago and start regulating all the ways in which we use cannabinoid products as kind of nutraceuticals or dietary supplements or so forth, which is functionally how the market is now. None of these products are federally approved, but largely, we kind of act like they're dietary supplements or nutraceuticals. But with Schedule 3, you'll see a much more significant involvement with the federal government in terms of everything from clinical safety studies to, regulation of lab processes and reference labs and testing and so forth.
Now, when we talked back in the spring, and originally we did an interview that ended up on KTRS Radio and their Ag Show, Early Mornings with Carl. Big shout out to Carl Middleman at the Big 550 KTRS. We talked about hemp regulations, and we talked about in Missouri specifically how Missouri saw a significant decline in hemp acres planted over the last 3 or 4 years. And back then, Epen, you did a really good job of explaining some of the barriers that farmers face in terms of bringing hemp, industrial hemp, or other consumable hemp to market. For folks who didn't catch the KTRS interview or the excerpts that we played on the first edition of the Farm Show, can you touch on some of the main hurdles that farmers see in the hemp industry?
Probably the biggest issue is twofold in terms of lack of processing and infrastructure to get to market. And two is kind of the genetic optimization for particular product markets, right? So like take example for textiles. So to produce textiles, you need to optimize the hemp fiber for a variety of qualities like softness, durability, color, etc. Right? That genetic optimization is just beginning to happen in the United States, and then you got to also think about various climate zones and soils, and what and how to optimize the plant for those conditions, right? And then say you've got to harvest. Well, you've got to harvest that crop. It wasn't until a few years ago that there was reliable ways of cutting down and processing a hemp fiber crop. And then you have to break up the fiber. There's a process called decortication. So typically you see these very large machines kind of set up to break up the fiber into its constituent parts. And then you got to process the specific fibers into thread, right? And to do that, you need a yarn spinning factory, which I don't know if we actually have any of those left in the United States. Maybe just a handful. In Sedalia, for instance, there used to be a Levi's factory that probably went out of business in the 18 or 1960s. But they used to make Levi's jeans in Sedalia, and they have a factory, an empty factory that used to do that kind of processing. And then once you make the thread, you can take it to another facility where you can actually make a textile product, right? But the difficulty for the farmer is harvesting and processing this on scale is, I'm not saying difficult, but we don't have the infrastructure for it. And, then you got to sell your processed, agricultural product to a vendor or someone who will to whatever end recipient who is willing to take it. And unfortunately, for in the textiles instance, we sent all of our textile expertise to Mexico, China, and India 30, 40 years ago. So like, there's very few Americans who even know how to operate these machinery, let alone there's practically no textile capacity in the United States anymore. So the problem, so in a nutshell, the problem facing the farmer is having to relocalize a lot of agricultural processing and infrastructure to get hemp back into production in the United States, and not just that, but some kinds of manufacturing. Right. So this is taking a while. It's happening. It's happening, but it's happening very slowly.
And an analogy off the air, even you and I have discussed, is it's probably tantamount to if someone just showed up with a couple bales of beautiful, high quality cotton and you had nowhere to take it, what are you going to do with it? And how expensive would it be to ship? So that's probably the analogy, right? Like you can have fantastic production, but if you have no distribution, it's worth nothing.
Exactly.
And when you've seen, I know that here in, for example, Franklin County, we have some folks that grow hemp. In your experience, pretty much all of the successful farmers in Missouri that are experimenting with hemp or have experience with hemp, they're probably using it for consumables, right?
That's where the market is now, or at least that's where the available market is right now.
Now, let's get back, as we wrap up here, let's get back to the conversation about the ballot initiative. What are some of the biggest misperceptions that you expect to hear from opponents, which I would assume, Epen, come from, you might call them the cannabis cartel or a marijuana monopoly, but what are some of the biggest lies or outright misstatements you anticipate hearing throughout this ballot initiative process?
They'll say that we want kids to buy Delta 8 gummies in gas stations and end up in the hospital.
So it will be it'll be, you anticipate a fear mongering campaign of watch out for your kids, hide your women, hide your children. Here come the hemp gummy people.
Right.
I see. Okay. And then let me ask you another question here, Eben, because I noticed this in a Rebecca Rivas piece in the Missouri Independent as well. Can you explain the provision that has to do with homegrown marijuana?
Yeah. So right now in Missouri, there's a structure for people to get a registration with the state and grow like 6 plants of their own. But what ends up happening is, if you do this correctly, you can produce quite a lot of product. Like an outdoor grown plant can produce 3 to 5, maybe more pounds, right? Which is far more than an individual consumer might need in a year. And it's still, and although I can grow and possess my own like home weed, there's no legal mechanism for me to really give it away or sell it or whatever. So the way that we reform this system is basically say, look, if you have been able to grow your own marijuana at home, you should be able to get it to a lab to get it tested and make sure it's safe and know the potency and whatnot. And the state should have some regulations that you have to comply with, but you should be able to sell your home grow marijuana to another adult, to a manufacturer, to a retailer, and be able to do that as you see fit.
And am I way out of left field here by saying choosing 6 plants seems really arbitrary? Like, where did the six come from?
I have no idea. I don't know how that, and I don't like these arbitrary things. So, one of the things in the proposal we did is number one, we raised it to 10, but we also say the legislature can authorize larger amounts should there be a constituent demand.
I see. And so here's more, as we wrap up here, Epen, here's more of a, I guess, esoteric question. And Brad and I on our morning show have often poked fun at the fact that it feels like the original 2022 measure that passed and that has been implemented, it feels like there's a lot of regulatory pieces that were not thought through, or at bare minimum, were not appropriately staffed. When you look at your proposal, is it fair to say that you're dismantling a lot of the unnecessary regulation, or is it more fair to say that you're putting common sense regulation in, or common sense stipulations in about how exactly the state will administer the program? Because I think there's a difference there between passing a giant constitutional amendment that has a million unfunded regulations versus saying we're just going to do a few things and do them right.
Yeah, I mean, we are definitely trying to diminish the burden on the state of unnecessarily regulation because I mean, the state does not have a great expertise in marijuana. I mean, we have a regulatory agency that was created by constitutional fiat division of cannabis regulation, and these people, very good people, very good civil servants, no doubt, but they have no regulatory experience in medicine. They have no regulatory experience in things like testing, laboratory testing. A lot of the people they're hiring are from law enforcement because and I don't know what the hiring situation is, but we basically have like a mini FDA in Missouri regulating the marijuana industry. And so being able to say, well, if the federal government's going to do this anyway, we should let them handle it and not assume the burden seems very rational to me. Saying that all these regulations shouldn't be in the Constitution where they're inflexible and instead letting the General Assembly approach them, which is the way it's supposed to be. That gives businesses and public safety stakeholders and all of these and the people of Missouri a lot more flexibility with how this program could be operated and run.
Eben, you've been generous with your time. Can you tell us where folks can find out more about these ballot proposals?
Well, the website is mosinglemarket.com.
And folks can follow you on social media just by looking up Eben Thampy, isn't that right?
That's right. That's right.
The Facebook, the Twitter, the X, the Instagram. Don't forget the Instagram. Eben's got a lot of man about town posts on the old Instagram there. Eben, thanks for your time today, and we appreciate having you on.
Yeah, always good to hear from you. And let's check in next time I'm in St. Louis.
Yeah, absolutely, Eben. You've been listening to The Farm Show. That's Farm and Ranch, Missouri, here on Westplex Talk 1045. As always, you can join us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube at Farm Show Radio. We'll see you next Saturday at 10 a.m.